Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience. This is the 7th event of the virtual symposium, Recursive Colonialism, Artificial Intelligence and Speculative Computation. We are the Critical Computation Bureau, a collective of researchers, artists and writers working at the intersection of technology and culture, computer science and information theory, aesthetics and politics. Recursive Colonialism, Artificial Intelligence and Speculative Computation 2020 aims to provide interventions in the technopolitics of racial capitalism and its recursive regeneration, mixing together critical and creative practices and borrowing models and methods from philosophy of technology, Black studies, political theory, computer science, and information theory, as well as media aesthetics, cultural and digital media theory. Please check our manifesto on the website and the social text online publication Control Societies at 30 Technopolitical Forces and Ontologies of Difference. We also thank Duke University, which has supported this symposium, together with University of Pennsylvania and la Università di Napoli, l'Orientale. For more information on this project and to contact us, feel free, please, to check out our website, www.recursivecolonialism.com, and to follow our socials. My name is Luciana Parisi. My co-facilitator today is Oana Parvan. We call this today Symposium Episode 07, Mediterranean Archives and Postcolonial Technocultures. And we accompany today's dialogue with the screening of Al di là di qua by Alessandra Cenelli and Ofer Thompson, which you can access on our website alongside with an original text written by our co-curators, Alessandra Ferlito and Olga Solombreno. The format of this session will be the following. Our guests will talk for 20 minutes each, then 10 minutes each. After that, the speakers will address a few questions that you can type in your Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please remember to state clearly which speaker your question is addressed to. Our co-facilitator will pick up as many questions as possible and the chair will address them to the panelists. I also want to remind all the panelists not to check the Q&A box as all the questions will be verbally asked by the chair. Please type in your question in the Q&A box at any time of this session. This session is also streamed live on our YouTube channel. Today, we are very proud to host a dialogue between our guest speakers, Iain Chambers and Tiziana Terranova. Iain Chambers is an independent critic and writer. He is known for his interdisciplinary and intercultural work on music, popular and metropolitan cultures. More recently, he has transmuted this line of research into a series of post-colonial analysis of the formation of the modern Mediterranean. He is author of Urban Rhythms, Pop Music and Popular Culture, then Popular Culture, the Metropolitan Experience, Border Dialogues, Journeys in Postmodernity, Migrancy, Culture and Identity, Culture After Humanism, and most recently, Mediterranean Crossing, the Politics of an Uninterrupted Modernity. Tiziana Terranova is Associate Professor of Cultural Studies and New Media in the Department of Human and Social Sciences, Università di Napoli, l'Orientale. She is the author of Network Culture, Politics for the Information Age, and numerous essays about digital media in journals such as Theory, Culture and Society, Culture Machine, New Formation, Sea Theory, and Edited Collections. She's a member of Euronomade and a co-founder of the Technoculture Research Unit. Welcome to you both, Tiziana and Iain, and now over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luciana. Thank you and the Critical Computation, the co-conspirator of the Critical Computation Bureau for having made me a part of this wonderful adventure of organizing this symposium, and which I learned a lot from, both from the process of organizing and also from the different papers and the attendees' questions. So thanks to everybody who's also been participating by asking questions and being a part of it in this way. And I would also like to thank Iain Chambers for having accepted being part of this conversation. We've been talking with Iain for a long time because we've been colleagues at the University of Naples Orientale in the same department, the same research group, but this is the first time that we actually have the opportunity to have a kind of proper formal conversation about issues concerning technology, the Mediterranean, post-colonial thinking. So I really welcome this opportunity. So now I'm gonna, stop the video and start my presentation. So we call today's presentation the Mediterranean Archives and Post-Colonial Technoculture, to kind of mix the lines of different research, such as the notion of technoculture that we've been working with in the context of Naples, and together with the post-colonial question and Mediterranean as a critical space, which has also been very much the core of our collective work. In fact, the line of thinking that I'm gonna explore today with you, it's very much part of a series of conversation and study groups, especially, which I've been lucky enough to join in the past 10 years of my, in the past decades and a half of my time in Italy, especially, and such as the Center for Postcolonial and Gender Studies and the Technoculture Research Unit, L'Orientale, the Feminist Future Group, and also the network of political ecologies of the present, and now the Critical Computation Bureau, which has also been a wonderful learning experience in coming to grips with new developments in computational technologies and machine learning. In fact, I think that, intellectual life thinking very much in agreement with Stefano Harney and Fred Moten in the Undercommons when they say, is there a way of being intellectual that isn't social? Moten and Harney answer objections about the use of the term study as being intellectual, as a kind of intellectual life, or something that was reserved just for the few, saying that study actually is something that you do with other people. It's like about talking, walking around with other people, working, dancing, suffering, eating quite a lot in our case, and some reducible convergence of all three. And this is also a speculative practice. So I'm happy to say that we are in the process of co-writing together also with Iain, the introduction to the Italian translation of the Undercommons, which has also been a kind of collective effort for the publishing house Tamo. I like to bring together, I'm thinking about today's dialogue as a way to bring together all these different conversations that have happened and which have been part of concerning the relation between technology, computation, and thinking about colonialism. I really like the way, I think it's been really powerful, the ways in which Luciana and Ezekiel have introduced the concept of recursion as a way to think about the logic of colonialism. Recursion, as you will know by now, if you follow this event, is a concept that belongs to the theories of cybernetics. It refers to the feedback loops from the outputs to the inputs of systems, and it's a way of patterning. It's got this patterning structure. You can see an example of a recursive generation of a structure in the Sierpinski gasket on the right. So it's about, it's a concept that conceptualized in computational systems. However, it's also quite crucial to second wave cybernetics thinking, such as Maturana and Varela notion of autopoiesis, and Gregory Bateson's inflection of this autopoiesis in relation to ecological and cultural systems. So we owe it to Bateson the notion of recursive epistemology. So it's very interesting to me, being located at the intersection of this study of technology and post-colonial theory, the notion of seeing colonialism as having a logic which is recursive, or the epistemology of colonialism as being kind of a cybernetic process of recursion. which means it's a kind of patterning of space, of the global space. And also the connection, I think, quite important between capitalism as a recursive epistemic logic patterning the world, and the notion of racial capitalism, which, as you might know, is a concept introduced by the black radical tradition, in particular Cedric Robinson, taken up by Lisa Law in The Intimacy of Four Continents, quoted by Luciana and Ezekiel. So the notion of racial capitalism suggests that capitalism is not just about the subsumption or formal or real of the world, which is about making all the world similar or the same under the power of capitalism as a homogenizing force, but that capitalism actually incorporates crucially a kind of a racial logic. So it seizes upon colonial divisions, identifying particular regions for production and others for neglect, and certain populations for exploitation and still others for disposal. So in the process of subsumption, which is a classical Marxist concept, recursivity allows to understand also how the racial grammar operates, and how the operation of racial capital also proceeds by patterning the global space according to a matrix of colonial separability, division, and context. And this is something that, again, Luciana and Ezekiel pick up on in Recursive Colonialism, making a link, again, very interesting, between the recursivity as the kind of logic of a system that never closes down on itself, because every iteration of recursivity does not simply reproduce the system, but introduces elements of contingency, which creates kind of a new liminal zones. This process operates also in today's ontologies of data and algorithms. So injecting the sociogenic code, a term that Sylvia Winter develops from the work of Frantz Fanon, and its inscription of the negative marker into the new space of algorithmic culture. And this is the kind of operation of the sociogenic coding of the other, the colonial matrix of division and conquest, the colonial acceleration of separation and divisibility is something that you can clearly see at work in the Mediterranean, in the space of the Mediterranean today, which is where we are speaking from, which has become exactly that kind of a space of division. Denise Ferreira da Silva in Differences Without Separability starts from the European states' responses to the refugee crisis, especially evident in the migration through the Mediterranean, as something that clearly operates by putting the racial grammar and lexical at work as a form of ethical description, which has uncertainty also at its core. So, picking up, I want to pick up on Ron English characterization of the forms of racism or racial classification enacted in the African continent, and its division between the kind of Orientalist concerning the kind of North Africa and primitivist forms of racism in the South, which recursively return in the coding of refugee as either Muslim terrorist, disguised as refugee, and starving African disguised as asylum seeker. So Denise Ferreira da Silva invites us to question cultural difference and the way in which it sustains such statements of uncertainty that effectively undermine claims of protection under the human rights framework. So what da Silva calls for is the apocalypse in the end, abolition. This is how Luciana and Ezekiel start recursive colonialism. They say, this is the kind of word that always scares us with the idea of apocalypse. The world is going to end. COVID is just the latest instantiation, but the world, it's just like a threat. It's a liminal space which never actually materializes. Because that would be nice, actually, if the world as we know it ended, with the pandemic, people have been saying, we don't want to go back to normal. This should be an opportunity to kind of abolish a whole order of things, which is and the root of the pandemic in its combination of the kind of ecological devastation of the planet and also the destruction of the infrastructure of social reproduction, such as the health systems. So the end of the world as we know it also involves a dissolution of cultural differences for da Silva and the production of human collectives as strangers, and her invitation to release thinking from the grip of uncertainty and embrace the imagination's power to create with unclear and confused impressions and uncertain in this conference is displaying itself as something that can happen through art and also through the kind of logic of incompleteness of computational systems, offering us another way to think about the future or the potential of technology. So what does the question of technology look like from the point of view of the Mediterranean? So I'd like to quote here from Iain Chambers and Marta Cariello's recent publication in Italian, I'm afraid, The Question of the Mediterranean from 2019, where the argument that they make is that the Mediterranean is not a pre-given thing. It's not a kind of a matter-of-fact kind of space, but it's culturally and politically produced. The Mediterranean is a European invention, and for whom, they ask, is the Mediterranean and not the Bahr al-Rum, the Roman Sea, or Al-Bahr al-Shami, the Syrian Sea. What they suggest is that the separation, which is enforced in the lines that are producing the necroentropic disaster, catastrophe of the Mediterranean right now, are based in the erasure or the attempted containment and displacement of the entanglement and superpositions of the three Mediterraneans, the Asian, the African, and the European, which would constitute a sedimented, intersectional, moving, and differentiated Mediterranean. The question of the Mediterranean, to me, it's interesting. It's also an interesting angle where to think about the cosmotechnical question, so to speak. I'm not sure how many of you probably know about UQE notion of cosmotechnics, which has been developed into a book from an article published in eFlux. And it's a very interesting article because it questions the notion that there is only one line or one way of thinking about technology. He calls it monotechnologism. And this is the idea that technology is an anthropological universal and that its essence, such as discovered or established in the Mediterranean space, the northern shore, of course, in Greece, is techne or poiesis. And then when he migrated north towards England in the Industrial Revolution, it became technology. And hence it's a product of European modernity. What UQE proposes is that technology should not be seen as an anthropological universal, but enabled and constrained by particular cosmology. So rather than a single technology, we should think about multiple cosmotechnics. And so he asks every non-European culture to systematize its own cosmotechnics and the history of such cosmotechnics. So I've been trying to think about, the question concerning technology in the Mediterranean. And I think what we have had until now is something that we can clearly define as a kind of a monotechnological discourse, which was very apparent in 2011 when North Africa, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, also the Middle East, Iran, Algeria, erupted in different ways and with different intensities against national authoritarian governments. And I'm thinking about the ways in which these events were conceptualized or not even conceptualized, just rolled out as the kind of the instantiation of the democratic logic of technology into countries which are, were not supposed to be about technology at all, which did not belong to this, belong to the ancient, like the Mediterranean is where you have algorithms started, the zero was mysteriously introduced, but it belongs safely there in the past. And this monotechnological discourse was questioned by, for example, the three books that you can see displayed on the screen. And in particular, I think that Donatella Della Ratta's book, Shooting a Revolution, which is based in ethnography in Syria during the beginning of the revolt and then the civil war, and which is marked by the mourning for a friend who was martyred in Syria prison, and he was a hacker activist. Donatella Della Ratta presents very well the ways in which the single lineage of technology, which was pushed onto the kind of Syrian hipster youth, gave us this delusion of participating in this kind of being able to use images as evidence, of what happened, and mobilizing international public opinion, which was completely dampened by the effect of the kind of algorithmic logic instead inscribed in platforms such as YouTube. So from this point of view, I would like to briefly end on, again, the question of technology from the point of view of the Mediterranean, by looking back at this study that we did together socially with various postgraduate students at L'Orientale, which are now mostly part of the Technoculture research unit, where we're actually looking for a different genealogies of computational forms and digital media, and how we selected these books, and we really delved into them to try to kind of, with all the problems that they posed. I'm thinking here maybe these three books can be seen as representing this kind of strange Mediterranean space between inverted commas. So Ziliski's An Archaeology of Media takes us through Eastern and Southern Europe in tracing a kind of technical genealogy of hearing and seeing by technical means. We also read Laura Marx on the Islamic aesthetic, computational aesthetics of Islamic classical art, and it's the political theology of infinity that it unfolded. We'd also read with great interest Ron Igla's African Fractals, and I'm thinking also about the essay that preceded it, African Influences in Cybernetics, where he questions the very idea even of African cybernetics, and put into question the idea of a single essence to make the diasporic space, or diasporic dynamic, the kind of the core of this black line of cybernetic thinking that we've seen exposed also by Luciana Parisi in her accounts of Octavia Butler's thinking about mind and artificial brains. So I would like to end where I started, that is with study, that is by, maybe presenting the hypothesis or the idea to you, which I'm going to develop more in my conversation with Ravi Sundaram, that even this, while there is no single cosmotechnics, but cosmotechnics need to be thought beyond cultural difference and more in terms of this overlapping space. I don't think we will be getting, the kind of machine learning and forms of artificial intelligence we like, including the question of environmental cost, without learning to study with a machine. And so if you want to learn to study with a machine and in ways that do not reproduce universality, but which transform it through practices of difference with inseparability, we again, the question of institutions of study need to be raised. And I have here a selection of various kind of these kind of institutions in this entangled superposition space-time and haunted space-time of the Mediterranean, from Federico II's court in Sicily in the early Middle Ages, where Fibonacci learned from Arab mathematicians about the sequence, Baghdad House of Wisdom, the Academy of Secrets of John Battista della Porta in Naples, the Epicurean Garden, such as presented in the Villa del Papiri in the Colanium, Hypatia School, and also Tahrir Square. If what we know about the occupation of 2011 was what wonderful places of study they also were, and not just of media communication. So I would like to close with this and leave the floor now to Iain Chambers. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiziana. Thank you, Tiziana. Thank you very much for this very interesting journey into methods and vision of studying together. Very, very, a lot of food for thought here, and I'll be very interested to unpack this conversation further. In the meantime, we're going to go to hear Iain Chambers' presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to try and talk, I guess it might be slightly a bleak approach to what Tiziana has laid out so well, by thinking about location and the social and cultural and political location of speaking from within the Mediterranean and trying to approach the question of post-colonial technologies. I'm going to insist on the idea of trying to pull the Mediterranean away from a single and overwhelming narrative, and so to reappropriate it in a manner that registers our cultural and historical limits. And I think this may be important when we come on to discuss what we mean by post-colonial technocultures. So it's a space and place of unlearning and relearning, something which I think the film by Alessandra Cianelli, Al di là di qua, that follows our conversations tonight, proposes we do in a political and a poetical fashion. This is introduces the idea, also already announced by Luciana Parisi in the opening discussion of this series, of unauthorized and alien epistemologies, which in turn lead to matters beyond the ordained value of matter. So to think with the Mediterranean, Mediterranean archives, this is a map, of course, of the Département of France 100 years ago, when Algiers was part of France, when there were over 1 million Europeans living here. So we're a site of migration, not from south to north, but from north to south. And to think about this idea of migration, the migration of Europeans around the rest of the world, and the challenge of this recursivity to the conceptualization and computation of the present. So there are deep links between Algiers 100 years ago and the present situation today in Palestine, Israel. So it's to register above all the formation of the modern Mediterranean as a colonial lake, directly controlled from London, Paris, and Rome. And here it means to consider what escapes this coloniality, and to insist on the incalculable and what slips through the nets of a still hegemonic positivism. Yes, what I would call hegemonic positivism. That is the faith in the truth of the European human and social sciences, the idea that they're able to render the world transparent, and to slip beyond that and try and go through and beyond that to encounter that we don't know what we thought we knew. So it means to work with uprooted geographies and with what the Chicano writer Cheria Moraga calls theories in the flesh, theories in the flesh. So here archives, and here these archives bring together one of the histories of the last 200 years in the Mediterranean. Archives refer to constructions and processes that break away from the teleology of linear progress to expose the continued racialization of knowledge in the colonial constitution of the categorization and explanation of the existing hierarchies of the planet and its white patriarchal order. So we have here, if you can see on the top right hand, French troops defeating the Mamelukes in Egypt in 1798. And then beneath that, we have the invention and construction of the Middle East between the Middle East being constructed through the direct control of Paris and London, and the invention of modern nation states such as the Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and in 1948 the State of Israel. And then on the left-hand side, we have this young migrant, so-called illegal migrants, young girl arriving on the Greek island of Lesbos in 2016, civil war in Syria. And it's just the idea these are all interconnected. So it's this overlapping and intersecting histories that continue to constitute and construct a present. They are, if you like, spirals of time, traced in cartographies of asymmetrical power that connect the colonial past to the colonial present. And here lies, if you like, the disquieting slide, that is a slippage, from the slave ship to the present ship of the modern nation state. So we have a slave ship in the 17th century. We have a ship full of Italian migrants leaving Naples or Livorno, Buenos Aires or New York. And then we have an example of one of the contemporary boats seeking to cross the Mediterranean, as it does every night. So this, of course, opens up other archives central to making the Mediterranean. That is a brutal archive of migration as the motor of modernity, as you saw earlier with the Europeans moving to North Africa, remembering that, for example, in 1935, 35% of the population of the capital of Libya, Tripoli, was composed of Italians. And that's not that long ago. So we find ourselves at sea, beneath wider and wilder skies, where we encounter the constant of colonialism and the haunting racism that produces a violent grammar of inhospitality etched on the body of the contemporary migrant. The spirals of time as opposed to the linear chronologies of accredited history, these sustain and release the recursive dynamics of other inconclusive archives entangled in indeterminacy and contingency. So the idea here is to work with the failure of Occidental historiography, sociology, and philosophy, and their faith in rendering the world transparent to their will. This leads to what Naveda Khan and Hassan Azad call an anthropology of uncertainty, or as Denise Ferreira suggested in the initial conversation, a knowing without modern categories. Critical response and to take a responsibility for what Ashur Bembe calls becoming black of the world. That is production of subjection.
Iain, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There probably is a problem with your microphone. I don't know whether it's paper wrestling on your microphone, but at the last 3 minutes, it wasn't really, we couldn't really hear. Would you mind to?
Okay, so I'm talking about,
I'm talking about
the failure of Occidental historiography, and sociology and philosophy, and their faith in rendering the world transparent to their will. So it leads to what I've proposed, this idea of an anthropology of uncertainty, or a knowing without modern categories, as Denise Ferreira da Silva suggested in the initial conversation. So this idea of leading to the production of alternative forms of knowledge in this, what Ashur Bembe calls of becoming black of the world, that is a recognition, a registration of other practices in politics in an emergent planetary formation that is without resolution or reparation. And it takes us, I'd like to suggest, to a place which Merleau-Ponty, some 60 years ago, referred to as lying between the algorithm and the mystery of language. So I'm going to play, hopefully, a short piece of music.
لم تقع أحداث خطيرة بعد ذلك.
Okay, so I'm going to now propose a series of questions, which we can then go on to discuss. Firstly, what if digitality, like modernity, is colonialism by other means, as it continues to operate within an exclusive Occidental debate, what counts for knowledge and what constitutes the human? The seeming omnipotence of digital technology to render the world transparent and calculable constantly pulls us back into the paradigm of declared objectivity and neutrality of the natural and social sciences. So the question is, how do we mess up? How do we mess up this colonial model of a unilateral accumulation of knowledge, linear in time and universal in space? How do we register and respond to difference without separability? In the world of digital authoritarianism, even contesting the codes and the algorithms is a critical modality, which, if we are to follow Fred Morton and Stefano Hani in the Undercommons, even this reproduces and restates their authority. At the same time, it is here we struggle for a philosophy of another kind that responds not to instrumentality, but to necessity. Right now, the increasing use of drones in the Mediterranean leads to the final abandonment of social involvement in the biosurveillance and saving of unwanted bodies and discarded lives. Smart bodies take migrants far below the category of bare life and anonymous flesh to arrive at the abstract mathematical necropolitics of plus or minus, life or death in a deadly numerical calculus. It is the presumed neutrality and objectivity of technology and information, even more than racial profiling written into the historical premises and cultural policy of big data. It is this which betrays a deep incubation in the refusal to register the languages and limits of Occidental hegemony and white supremacy. So from the Black Atlantic to the Black Mediterranean, these seas of dispossession and unbelonging have constantly demonstrated the political and juridical limits of modernity, operating a constant critique of the epistemic foundations of Occidental democracy. Those on the water, the wretched of the sea, the damned of the Mediterranean, who cannot source their identity in the territory of a nation state, are without rights. They have no social or human validity. They are without a place in the world. But yet they simultaneously sustain black holes of concentrated historical and cultural energy that exists, persists, and resists. They provoke the end of a certain philosophical constellation and the inauguration of another. They dub modernity, cut up its languages, and remix the coordinates, leaves a gap, an opening, even a wound. So here we might begin to think of so-called illegal immigration, its unauthorized practices and knowledges constructed on the move in migration as a form of political hacking that exposes all the limits of liberal democracy and its concepts of citizenship. This is an alternative algorithm channeled and codified by other bodies that matter, not our own. Here, technology is not merely instrumental and technological, but rather a cultural and historical necessity. Not an object, but a process. That mixture of danger and saving power that Heidegger, who I notice is quoted a lot in these meetings, that Heidegger, quoting the German romantic poet Hölderlin, proposes, the mixture of danger and saving power. But now it takes us into far deeper waters, offshore, deliberately drifting away from the colonial imperative, the Occidental episteme, towards other horizons. Okay, I think, yeah. How much time do I have left?
You have another 5 minutes.
Okay, well, so, and then, to this then is what I'm trying to articulate, I suppose, alongside artificial intelligence and speculative computation, while listening and interrogating its order of discourse, is based on a certain location while looking to another order of time and space, one that seeks to disturb the Occidental measure of the world. To what degree do the planetary pretensions of the Occident and the digital coincide? To what degree they do coincide is an open but also a pressing point, which I think we're all trying to address. Above this, and above all, this is a querying of the idea of language as a transparent means of communication, registering its colonial pretensions while promoting the idea of language, not as transparency, but as a means of sabotage and the portrayal of that desire for transparency. Perhaps means no longer to treat language as our slave, which means to engage with thinking after Occidental philosophy, in its wake, while breaking away, again to quote that reactionary radical Heidegger, while breaking away on the way to language. Here I just want to very briefly reference the two video works that accompany today's discussion that perhaps propose a more ironic and disenchanted critical disposition, like that exposing the working of first world colonizing capitalism and electronic waste, evidenced by Alexandre Felito and Olga Solobrino in the presentation of Françoise Corneze's video, Core Dump Dakar. And finally, the idea of the inconclusive that deliberately betrays the closure of rationality and leads to leaving the gaps open, registering the limits of a lexicon and its associated language, as in the cut-up, bricolage, and collage poetics proposed by Dele Adeyemo and Christopher Oliver in the Cosmogony of Racial Capitalism. Yeah, that's the other video you can see on YouTube. Here, following the cultivation of sugarcane from Asia through and over the Atlantic to the Americas, the archive unwinds, exposing other computations and complications of time and space, other alien cartographies yet to come. Okay. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Iain. And I just can see very interesting lines of discussion that are already unfolding here between, you know, the alien computational archives and the alien modes of studies. But I would like to leave to hear more from Tiziana at this point as a response to Iain's presentation.
It's interesting because we've been having this conversation before with Iain in a way, right? But we've been having it in kind of, you know, those kind of discussion where you say something and somebody else says something. So things are never, you know, really clearly spelled out. So what I would like to say, my reaction to Iain is, I think that we have the opportunity and there's also a necessity to let's say, displace or, you know, kind of not be so centered anymore into the kind of critique of technology as this form of instrumental reason, which is also colonial, which is all about, you know, making the world transparent and turning it into the image of the West. Not because this isn't true, because it's also true, but exactly because the idea of recursivity implies, first of all, you know, it's a kind of technological difference, maybe we can put it like that, although, you know, obviously it's quite different cybernetics. So the idea of recursivity implies that even this logical self-reproduction is never completely closed, and it's not because there is a critical position that kind of exposes it, but because in itself, you know, it continues to create this something that is not, it never closes it completely on itself. And second, because what is happening, and I think this has been really interesting for me in Luciana's research, is that that kind of logic or reason, now that we call instrumental reason, it's got something in it. You know, it's developing something in it. It's showing us, and artificial intelligence and machine learning are teaching us about it. You know, if you look at them in a certain way, so if you don't look at them as the latest installment of the kind of spirit of technology that has come to dominate the world, they're revealing something which is actually an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the world not to be made transparent once again and dominated, but to introduce this kind of alien element. And this alien element can also come from, you know, that which you say disturbs Occidental reason, can disturb it much. It's probably going to be much more, even more powerful in disturbing this kind of reason once this new formal reason, which is this kind of incomplete, uncertain reason, gets unleashed properly around the planet. So I don't know what's going to happen in the, you know, we've seen a previous phase in the Mediterranean. So we have seen the media, the social media platform being rolled out on this process, on this promise of the Creative Commons, of the kind of liberatory character of technology, and this kind of monotechnological discourse. Say, we are coming to you, primitive Oriental people, you know, to bring you democracy, and we've seen it failing. But you know, in that failure, we also seen forms of study, you know, which also, you know, produced something. What's going to happen when machine learning is going to become a popular cultural form, you know, on a global scale? And it's not going to be just a question of media, which Alex Galloway, McKinsey work, they're right in saying there's something about media that always brings us back to the question of determinacy, right, and mediation. But it's going to be about, you know, this kind of formal reasoning that are going to become quite popular. You know, what's going to happen then? So I think we have an opportunity by engaging with these new forms of reason that is emerging in computational thinking to kind of dislodge that kind of positivist reason that you're talking about. And I'm going to be speaking about this more when my conversation with Ravi Sundaram, you know, what also drawing on Patricia Clow and George Steinmetz, the notion of methodological positivism as the unconscious of the social science. So I think there is an opportunity there. And at the same time, as I said, I would like to avoid the idea of a kind of multicultural technologism. So that there is a kind of a Mediterranean technology, Chinese technology, African technology, because, you know, work like such as yours is really the post-colonial thinking, which is being blamed for not, accused of not caring about technology, is actually very useful to problematize an uncanny trend, you know, the reproduction of cultural difference in the domain of technology that cosmotechnics a little bit carries with it. So that's my take.
Thank you very much, Tiziana. I do have also some questions, but keep them on after Iain responds.
Well, my response is certainly I agree with much of what Tiziana says. I think what I'm trying to argue for is the necessity and the importance of inscribing limits into our discourse. And by that I mean the awareness of where we're speaking from, the awareness of our cultural and political capital when we speak. So if you take an example, what happened in North Africa in 2011, the so-called Arab Spring. What intrigued me about that was how Western journalists, politicians, and academics were taken by surprise. And there was a very rapid movement to try and understand the situation, the complex situations in North Africa and also in Syria, by basically bringing into play what is a European or Occidental template of explanation. And I think it's very important that we start moving into a space which is not simply that of looking, constructing objects, creating a discursive regime able to apparently explain what's happening elsewhere, or what is also happening amongst us, but we may not be aware of it in our own cities and lives, and moving to this idea of speaking alongside. So we're going to talk about post-colonial technologies, and we're going to reference that in a planetary frame. At the same time, it means we can't speak for the planetary frame as we are accustomed to do in the past, in a sort of European master dialogue, which explains everybody to our point of view and brings everybody under our point of view. So it's this idea about also, I guess, opening up a space of where you register the limits and also registering the importance of listening. And we're aware, I mean, as Tiziana was saying, we can't foretell the technologies, artificial intelligence, the future of that in this planetary frame. We cannot foretell it. So, and we can't, so it's also something which is always going to break away from our authorization. And that's what intrigues me. In other words, as Stuart Hall once put it, it is without guarantees. So I think it's important we register that in what we're saying, which is not in any ways to undo the argument that Tiziana's making, but I think it's to cross it, to traverse it with a series of questions, which we may not be able to answer, but I think it's important they're registered in that. And also, otherwise it ends up just the first world, speaking to the first world in many ways. And I think we can't speak in the name of others, but we can at least begin to register our limits and begin a process of registering other spaces that coexist using modernity in a way which we have not authorized and which exist alongside us. I think that's what I would say about that.
Yes, thank you, Iain. That's no, please. You wanted to add something else? Please, well, go ahead. Go ahead.
Impacts upon the whole, institutionalization of academic Occidental knowledge, which in some ways we're skirting around. We're talking about directly and mainly indirectly, but I think it's also recognizing that. So the whole formation of social and human sciences. And it is about not cancelling them. You can't cancel them, otherwise you will be out without a voice. But it is about sort of remixing them in a way which leaves ends open, leaves spaces open, delivers us over to what I call an inconclusive space.
Microfono.
Okay.
Couldn't hear very well the last part that you said. There's something with your microphone.
Yeah. The idea of taking care or curating what I would call, and you've also mentioned this, an inconclusive space. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I could. Yes.
I guess this question we probably will unfold this discussion further as we get along in terms of what are all these different models of computational colonialism that one can unpack in time and also so diachronically but also synchronically in terms of which kind of different, why do we need in relation to what Iain also discussed, pointed out right now, a different articulation of technology or the relation between computation and colonialism coming from Africa, from Asia, or, even from, the kind of diasporic past. So in a way, there is a need to open up this different kind of mining, these different kind of knowledges at the same time as without trying not to fall into another universal model of technology. So I do pick up that both of you are trying to address this kind of very difficult problem, but at the moment I've got a few questions. So we might discuss this further as we get along. I've got a few questions that people have addressed. So whether we could go ahead and then try to unpack this, if you bear in mind these points as we go along. So I have a question from Iain, from Alexander Strecker. It's more like a question of clarification. You mentioned the phrase resolutional reparation, I think. Could you elaborate more on this idea, please? Thank you.
Well, that's simply, again, saying that I don't think there's all the, let's say, all the crimes committed by the West in terms of slave trade, racial capitalism, I don't think there's any form of reparation going to happen. What is important is in the registry of that past, we reconfigure the present. So it's about, again, registering that past in a manner which leads to another assemblage of political, cultural, historical possibilities. I don't think there's any way we can rewind history to get back to a situation which leads to a possible reparation in the present. Like if we take the present situation in Palestine, Israel, there's no ways one can cancel a colonial situation created by white settler colonialism. But what can, Israel cannot be cancelled, but it can be reworked, re-elaborated in a manner which leads to another form of being in Palestine and Israel. I think it's insisting upon the inconclusive and open-ended registration of the past and the reconfiguration of the present, leading to other possible futures.
Thank you, Iain. I still think that your microphone is a little bit, unfortunately, somehow blocking the sound to come out. So maybe there's a way in which we could repair that for next question. But I have a question now for Tiziana from Anonymous. Tiziana, in what way would you relate your work on the upper social and especially on social networks with the nexus submission, recursivity you addressed at the beginning of your talk?
Yeah, this is more about with the question of recursivity. Yeah, this is something that I was thinking of talking about, focusing more on in 2 days when I'm gonna be talking with Ravi about the question of the social, really, in social media. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm still trying to think about through this category. I can see how the kind of social of that we've been getting since the early 2010s, which has been a social, which has been imaged as a network. So the network has become the shape of the social and has become the kind of mesh that is allowed for the collection of data. Because we had big data since the big data has been big data before, and I think the largest source of big data was biotechnology before. So it was all data from bionomic research. But then the real search in data has come with social media, which means social networking platforms plus smartphone. That's where you get that. So the hypersocial considered as this kind of computational networked return of the social, which was supposed to have died or declined terminally in the 1980s. We had a whole bunch of people from Baudrillard to Deleuze himself, right, to say the end of the social. The social that has returned it's a network, it's big data, and the kind of recursive, again, generation of the social network topos. But again, it is something that I will be looking at more in a couple of days, because it's going to be the topic of my conversation with Ravi Sundaram, who brought the same argument up in a different way in his essay on the post-colonial city and then the transformation due to technology. So thank you for that question. It anticipates things a little bit.
Thank you, Tiziana. I have another question for Iain. From Martina Tazzioli to Iain. A twofold question for Iain Chambers. Could you elaborate on the parallelism between slave ships and migrant ships? As of course, even when we speak of, unquote, forced migration, it might be slippery to propose any straightforward continuity between slavery and migration, as it emerges also from the tricky debate on smuggling and trafficking nowadays. And relatedly, after tracing the colonial genealogy of contemporary migration and rightly showing continuities, how do we put this historical analysis to work in our present to understand very different hierarchies of racialization and subjugation? So in other words, I was wondering if you can explain a bit more how the concept of Black Mediterranean may be used in this sense. Thank you.
Okay. Well, of course, between talking about slave ships and slavery in the 16th century and talking about what is happening right now in the Mediterranean with boats, leaking boats seeking to cross it, there are, of course, discontinuities. There's no doubt about that. But I think it's important to register also continuities in the sense of thinking about the actual constitution of modernity and the centrality of slavery to its making and the centrality of exploited labor to its continuation today. So, of course, black people working in the fields of southern Italy are not exactly slaves, but the conditions in which they work are pretty close to indentured labor. So I think there's about the argument about continuities, which are very important. Otherwise, we just talk about discontinuities. It's very easy to fall back into the more traditional historiographical understanding that there are different chapters in time, and what does that past got to do with our present? I think that's very important to register the resonance, indifference of what has occurred in the constitution of modernity through centrality of slavery. And of course, and with that, the centrality of the racialization of the planet, creating hierarchizations which morally, and culturally, politically, and religiously justify the subjugation of others who are economic, political, and cultural work. And a way of doing that, I think, is to talk about the centrality of migration. Again, migration is nearly always referred to as a sort of social economical matter in the periphery of the making of modernity. Whereas if we open up that migration as an archive, we discover it to be central to the making of modernity. Again, it allows you to pull out arguments which have been covered over, forgotten about, to consider how migration is talked about today in contemporary Europe or in contemporary Italy, as though it's got nothing to do with us. What's happening right now has got nothing to do with what happened, say, 100 years ago, when large numbers of people from the rural zones, the poor rural zones of Europe, from Scandinavia, Scotland, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and Greece migrated. And how those actual intersecting histories, which allow us to reconfigure both maps of understanding of modernity and also reconfigure a very understanding of the constitution of the present through centrality of racism, centrality, that centrality. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when in the United States there was a whole debate about Italians, whether Italians were white. So to think about, to bring those elements out is to allow us to stitch together, to put together a very different configuration of the present through a past, which I would insist is not past, even though it doesn't come to us in a true form, in a direct form. It comes to us through our contemporary concerns and considerations. It's a contemporary making construction or history of our past.
Thank you, Iain. I think that's a very interesting question, and which also can open up different a kind of problematic if in the work of what does it mean to rewrite history? What does it mean that the past is in front of us to be hacked back and rewritten? In terms of what are the modes of again, the kind of specificity of the articulation of mathematical and computational power of racialization, and how the specificities don't end up reproducing a model of one model of colonialism, right? And because we had this discussion also within our our agency, the CCB, about how we call it colonialism, we call it colonialisms, and what is the validity of presenting one model that continue to reconfigure itself, as opposed to a model that becomes much more schizophrenic and much more open to be reconfigured by the place which is being it's where the colonization is in place. And that's how one can see different modes of resistance or different modes of articulation or collective studying, or kind of creating heretic knowledges, even in the smuggling, even in the use of mobile phones, and what you call this process in the making, whether this process in the making of the escape is is different. How is it different from the diasporic argument of the running away slave? So there are tensions there that are worth unpacking, so that different model of computational hacking can also allow to be brought forward. So I would like also to hear more from Tiziana about that, whether I could also take this question and bring it to Tiziana. How do you feel, Tiziana, you would think about in relation to your the argument that you made about how can we rethink cosmotechnics without creating another world of cultural difference, but at the same time recognizing this different kind of computational sovereignty and possibility of studying. I don't know if that makes sense. Whether you would like to say something.
Can you say it again? Not the last part, but the beginning of the question.
No, the beginning of the question was whether you imagine different modes of, because if we looked at the Mediterranean in terms of,
I keep thinking about Donatella Della Ratta's fieldwork in Syria. During the beginning of during the years, the immediately preceding year of the Syrian uprising, and how she talks about how all these kind of hacker spaces were rolled out. There was all this money, NGOs were putting money to turn to kind of create this figure, which was the kind of Syrian hacker, right? Which was just another version, a local version. It's like the McDonald's, right? That you have different foods, like the global version, and there would be the monotechnologies. But what could you do really if, rather than having this kind of universal model imposed, which comes from like the United States, and it's kind of parachuted into Syria, you actually managed to create spaces where you spoke alongside, but you also listened to each other and you worked together, without a universal model to unify you all. What could you do? What different understandings, what different lines of thinking could you bring to the development of the instruments? So I think the space for study in the Mediterranean is overly regulated. It's got all these provisions about the kind of work that you can do together between the northern shore, the southern shore, the eastern shore, the western shore. It's all policy, has Harmay and Moten call it. Policy, governmentality has completely invaded the Mediterranean as a space of study. And this contributes to this monotechnologism. So, what kind of institutions would you need to bring out a different practice and thinking of technology? So it's not about studying your own cosmotechnics, but it's about, recreating spaces where study across the different cultures and dimensions, asymmetrical as they might be, without a universal to rule them, without the Occidental Mediterranean coming in and teaching, the southern shore what to do. That's what I would be interested to do. And I think that possibility right now is foreclosed from so many sides. We're kind of held, the southern Mediterranean, at the moment I'm located at the very border, I can almost see Tunisia from here, but we are so far, because we are held together and separated by these European borders, which is creating this division, which is foreclosing these possibilities.
Thank you. Thank you, Tiziana. We can think about that more together. It's very interesting, both of you, insight into this question raised. And yeah, I think there's more to unpack, but I would like to go now at the another question by Stamattia Portanova to both. Are categories only the bad guys to be messed up with, in contrast with imagination? I'm thinking here of the importance of the notion of category for algorithmic power, racial categories, phenotypic categories. Is it impossible to think of alternative categorization, alternative schemas, new coordinates to guide our walking and talking and studying and cartographing together, as Yukoi also seems to suggest? Thank you. It's for both of you. Do I repeat or?
No.
Okay. Iain, would you like to start, please?
Okay. Well, I think that follows on a bit from what Tiziana said. I was thinking about this idea of creating a space between the idea of sophisticated specificities on the ground through our analysis, and at the same time the sort of what I would call the brutal long wave of racial capitalism and colonizing modernity. How to find a space in there, create a space. So it is about the categories are not simply the bad guys, but I think the categories have to be unanchored, unmoored, taken into spaces they're not necessarily authorized. So that's so the messing up is a bad fact. And in fact, there are think about social activities, social criticism, or critical activity in a social format. Some of us have been involved in ideas of floating laboratories, that is actually working at sea, going off land, which is about sort of weakening the usual territorial and nationalist framing of methodology, epistemologies, disciplines, and so on. So I think what Tiziana's pointed to is an important way of thinking with, through, and beyond the existing categorization of the Mediterranean and also the disciplinary protocols of specialization, anthropology, science, area studies, all that. So my theory is a way is to go offshore, to float, to learn to swim in unknown currents. Thank you for the question, Stamatia.
Yes, I'll go along with Iain that, no, categories are not the problem. I think it's fixed categories, reproductive categories, categories which work inside a pre-established grammar, such as the racial grammar, which are the problems. But of course you can, thinking about Borges' encyclopedia, right, which is often, quoted. So you can make up all kinds of categories. Again, it can become an occasion for study. And I think, that's a big issue, as you said, in machine learning. This question of categories and also runaway categories, categories that don't match, sleeping categories. There's a whole study to make of that. And I think it would be quite entertaining to see what these random categories that come up in these attempts to categorize the world. I remember Netflix was one of the first, the earliest investments in kind of categorization. Of course, it was Google search engine, but also Netflix categories for its films and various genres. When they still had CDs or DVDs, they would send them home, right? That's when they started. There was one of the first databases, and there were all kinds of weird categories coming up there as well.
Thank you, Tiziana. Thank you, Iain, very much. I have another question for you both from Nida Genova. Anida. Thank you to both of you for these very interesting presentations. I would be interested to hear your thoughts about the relationship between colonialism, racial capitalism, and imposition of a linear homogenizing time. The term recursivity can be used as a descriptor of an operative logic of colonialism, but in the work of Hans Stoller has been mobilized as a research method that is linked to a genealogical approach. Such a thinking about the interest in excavating different genealogies of computational media, which might also produce different temporality, that was mentioned by Tiziana. Do you think that there is a way to appraise different recursive logics and operations that can be reduced to a Western capitalist and colonial regime?
I think I was curious, though, I had the feeling sometimes in Luciana's and Ezekiel paper, but maybe they're here, both of them, one, in writing form and the other visibly, so and orally. I had the feeling sometimes that there was an opposition between, on the one hand, it was like recursivity, still introduces contingency, right? But then had the feeling that even this introduction of contingency was not enough because he was still bound to reproduction, right? So there was something about recursivity that is bound to reproduction, which never really dares to bring about the apocalypse because he always brings things back to order. And then this kind of notion of speculative computation, which looked like, that you needed to bring to bear on recursivity in order to kind of break it and bring the apocalypse on at last. So, but that was, that my feeling, when reading Luciana and Ezekiel was the recursivity overall, always brought things to order, not incompletely, but had a tendency towards reproduction. But again, I'm not, I'm at the beginning of my study of recursivity, so I don't dare to go farther than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that question poses a whole discussion about how we understand temporality in a way which is not simply linear or chronological. So if you take the idea of colonialism, racial capitalism, linear time, I think how that tends to be presented, in a very linear fashion, in the sense that it allows us to manage it and to create a catalogue of these various moments. And of course, I think the argument we're trying to make in different ways is about their contemporary present, that is the recursive present in the present. And that's why I'm also a bit unsure about when we use terms like synchronic and diachronic. I'm not sure about that, because I'm much more interested in the understanding of how it is all in a way synchronic. It's all part of the present. And so of course we know the past has occurred, but that past is only accessible through the present. Almost is all part of a complex synchronicity. And I think there we can find we're dealing with different temporalities, different tempos, different rhythms. That's why I played that piece of music by Camilo Gibran and Werner Hessler. It may seem a bit mystifying, but it was about suggesting about there are perhaps other languages which propose other temporalities, other ways of crossing, traversing modernity. Following sound is creating a different space as opposed to following the linearity which we're all employing right now in talking. There's an order, a linear order in use of language. And so to introduce those other languages which become also, I would suggest, it's not about music as an illustration of the present or of the past or a historical moment, but in a way, music as history, or not the sociology of music, but music as sociology. And it takes us into other spaces, other temporalities, other ways of sounding out modernity, which allows us to go back to questions like colonialism, racial capitalism, and linear time, and to really cut it up and reassemble it in an unexpected fashion and unauthorized fashion.
Thank you, Iain. Unfortunately, I don't know whether it's your connection or it's your microphone, but things are not completely hearable. But I think that what I've grasped, this is my train, sorry, what I grasped.
Iain's mind was haunted. There was some haunting going on.
I think it's interesting. I just would like to add just a little comment about this question of recursivity and nonlinearity and the contemporaneous. It's something that is co-present. And of course, I guess the work of Ezekiel and, trying to move through this question of ontology in terms of this complexity of temporalities that are coexistent and nonetheless are also inherited, as in the work, as for instance, Sylvia Winter talks about, with her elaboration from Fanon about the sociogenic, something is inherited, something comes from somewhere, right? So there's not that nothing comes, things happen ex novo. There's some kind of recursivity means also bringing forth something that has happened, an event that has happened and that keeps on happening, keeps on being repackaged somehow. And so there is one cannot deny that there is a kind of persistence of heredity at the same time as there is a kind of coexistence of temporalities. So there is something there that is not easy to work out as just a looking back at the past, because of course the past is never there. It so moves as well, but the movement is where the political implication, I think the political break can happen in distinguishing, the question of the diaspora from the question of contemporary migration. as well as different modes of knowledge. So it's a very, very interesting. I think there's a lot, like Tiziana would say, there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot to study here, and it's not easy to discern. But what is important, I think, is the political implication of this temporality. Where do we see the breaks? And why? So I have another few questions here. I have actually a question from Ezekiel for both. In a Patricia Cloud discussion of George Steinman's, I don't know how to pronounce Steinman's, methodological unconscious, she points to the tension between positivist social science, statistical modeling, and the reactionary move of critical scholars with phenomenological qualitative methods, maintaining ideas of the transparent subject and treating data as self-evident. Is there a possibility for transcendental empiricism in computation? And will it address the traps of colonial reason?
That's really interesting avenue. I suspect that's where also your research is happening, maybe at Ezekiel, right? I think that from what I read that you're doing, you're very much concerned with that. As far as my reading of the really interesting piece, the datalogical unconscious, which again I'm going to mention in a couple of days, was that the kind of you cannot the kind of opposing phenomenological data which maintain, as you said, intact, this kind of position of the researcher condemns the social science to become a kind of minority exercise on its own. And also a kind of illustrates authority. Already in the late 2000, Roger Barrows and Mike Savage, right, were saying that the academic sociology is losing power. It's not where research is happening anymore. We're becoming redundant. And I think that there is a risk of that. They might become just a game, an academic game, for maintaining little pockets. But that you need to address what's going on without giving up, the ethnographic methods altogether. It's not something that you have to throw it out of the window altogether, but you cannot just oppose it to the bad guy of data analysis. This is something actually that we are in the process of thinking about with another research group that we just started, where this issue has come up, the opposition between the people who do data analysis and the ethnographic method. So this is something that is agitating the social scientists, science communities, and any work that could help us to overcome that opposition at Ezekiel is welcome. Okay.
Iain, do you have the question? Would you like to? Should I repeat or?
Oh, no, I understood the question. I'm not sure I got much to add to that, to what Tiziana just said. I think I still think it's very deeply tied to the question of how positivism is embedded in an empiricist epistemology, which is so hegemonic in Anglo-American culture. So I think that there's a real question of how to unpack all that, which is what we're trying to do. And I'm not sure, obviously, again, because sociology, for example, which I was referring to, is, again, it's articulated, it operates in a very national frame. I mean, there's French sociology, Italian sociology, and there's Anglo-American sociology. But I think it's questions, again, seeking the gaps that might permit us to raise these questions about how the very premises of sociology, when the Constitution is present, how to rework all that in a way which allows us to test the simple idea that big data is somehow knowledge, and the usual confusion is all made all the time between knowledge and information. To insist upon the more sort of uncertain, unguaranteed nature of knowledge formation as process, as opposed to information somehow a static, stable entity which can be appropriated and applied.
Maybe I could follow with a point of it before we go to another question, because to you, Iain, when you mentioned Merleau-Ponty in your talk, about this line between the algorithm and the mystery of language. Your claim, you're kind of wanted to look back at language, not as transparency.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether, you know, because that's a question that has come up during the series, a long series of events and other millions of discussions that we have had in the background about what kind of, you know, whether, you know, how can the language become a means of sabotage, but not in terms of, you know, how you start working with the nonsensical, and whether we really need to hold onto this distinction between information and language, or, you know, that which is still, you know, somehow framed by, you know, the conceptual understanding of syntax or representation of syntax.
Well, you know, that's why I quoted return to Heidegger, right? On the way to language, as an idea about insisting upon the nature of the poetical humanity.
Sorry, Iain, could you try to turn off your video, and so we could try just the audio, see if it works.
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Wow. So that's a technological.
The video. Yeah.
Take too much bandwidth.
Okay. So I guess it's insisting upon the whole question of the poetical dimension, which was a shape, simple, linear, everything. But I don't think it's about the question of non-sense. I think it's about understanding there are other reasons. Like there are other reasons which are not necessarily linear rationality. I think that's what the Heidegger quote about on the way to is about. It was about precisely what is truth, the linearity of the rationalizing. So I think that remains, and that's why I insisted on. I would insist upon critical music again as a critical medium, because it brings to a rationalizing logic. What does it mean? Well, we can't answer that. So in fact, we can't answer that. And to register, the possibility, the impossibility, giving an answer, is already creating another critical space.
Okay, we kind of heard that, not completely. Unfortunately, yes, there is a haunting wireless connection where you are. There's no allowing us to hear everything correctly. Tiziana, I have a question for you from Sohail Rezenjad. The horrifying image for me is the image of a soul master who can simply turn off the switch whenever he wants. I'm referring to a recent uprising in Iran in 2019, where this image took shape, and Iran was in an internet blackout for at least 10 days. And since then, there have been a constant waves of arrests. So I was wondering if you are suggesting a way to break this recursive logic. How does this break happen if not through the apocalypse? And if it is through the apocalypse, as I guess you suggest, how do you go around the violence of that horrifying image? Thank you.
Thank you, Sohail. Such a difference from the way in which the same kind of power to turn off the internet worked in Egypt. You know, it's become a kind of mythical moment, the moment where the regime turned the internet off, and how it kind of backfired. And now you're telling me that instead, you know, the kill switch, the switch off the internet kind of moment, which was the symbol of how you couldn't stop communication, is actually worked, and it became paired to very strong repression. I don't have an answer to your question, because it's you know, it's something that requires, again, listening, you know, to what is happening over there. And the image of the apocalypse is the one evoked by the conference logo, and it's evoked by Luciana and Ezekiel at the beginning of their essay. because it is something they say it's made the apocalypse, the horrific character of the apocalypse. I think they suggest that it's almost a way like to scare people off from the fact that the apocalypse could actually be liberatory. You know, it doesn't need to be horrific at all. The moment of abolition, which we're hearing more and more, especially from the United States, you know, abolish prison. The whole moment of abolition is a kind of realized apocalypse. So it's not, you know, it's scary, but because the end of the world is scary, but the world we live in maybe is even more scary than its end. So I would like to talk to you more about this kind of issues. We had an interrupted conversation with Sohail, who was in Naples with us for a while, and then he had to go back with an epidemic. So I would really like to keep continuing the conversation that we had in Naples with him in the future. So thanks for this question.
Thank you to all this interesting question and for your discussion and for bringing forward all these points about different modes of recursivity, colonialism, and technological empires. But also, I just wanted to say that it's interesting that the question of the entanglement of technology, colonialism, and the apocalypse, becomes this moment in which is both the limit of knowledge, which can be worked either way. That the limit of knowledge as the threat of the apocalypse to happen, and the constant mode of post-apocalyptic living that one could argue has been going on, for 400 years for, certain kind of a diasporic entanglement with technology. So it's interesting how the limit of the apocalypse and as the limit of Western knowledge is actually the originator of many forms of post-apocalyptic way of living and histories that I guess both Iain and Tiziana have traced and archived and re-archived for us today. So whether I was wondering whether Iain has a last remark before we are going towards closure.
No, I have no last remark.
Okay.
Technological glitters, glitches.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. That's perhaps part of the question, right? Those
Yeah.
unplanned interruptions, which become interrogations, and which disturb the smooth surface of events. But thank you. I've learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Iain. Thank you, Tiziana. Thank you very much for this brilliant, another brilliant insight into this project. Thank you very much. Thank you to all audience and the questions. We'll see each other tomorrow. So tomorrow we have another panel at the same time, Politics Within Borders. So hopefully see you tomorrow, everyone. Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Luciana. Thank you, Iain.